and see who shows up today. How lovely. Welcome, everyone. Yeah. So, oh, there's Doug Burns. You know Doug.
Oh, hi, Doug.
Doug, you can not only turn your microphone on, but leave it on for the duration if you would, because I'm sure we can just make this a conversation like we're having a dinner party and everybody's included. How's that? Okay, I'm gonna be letting people in here. Oh, good. Here's an Iowa City guy, Tom Martin. And there we go. I'm going to be a little distracted while I let people in.
Sure.
But let's go ahead and start the process of introducing you to our guests today, who are David and Rose Donovan. They are co-authors of a book titled The Nastiest Saloon in Iowa: Murder, Prostitution, and Corruption in the Heartland. Now, there's a catchy title. David Donovan grew up in Western Iowa. Carol, I think, right? Is that right, David? Carol.
Yeah.
Graduated.
Just down the street from me, Julie.
Okay. All right.
Harris Drive, Simon.
From Iowa State University, earned his law degree from Georgetown and went on to a distinguished legal career as a partner at WilmerHale in Washington, D.C., before serving as general counsel and chief operating officer of the Washington Redskins. Now, I suspect we could probably do an hour on that as well, but
not consistent with my various contractual obligations.
That's many NDAs, so you can ask me.
Okay, all right. That's funny. Anyway, Rose Donovan is also an Iowa State graduate and great-granddaughter of Wallace Scott, the notorious saloon owner at the center of this story. And what began as David's interest in genealogy and Rose's curiosity about her own family history evolved into a years-long investigation through court records, newspaper archives, and land records and public documents. And together, they uncovered a forgotten chapter of Des Moines history filled with murder and corruption and prostitution, political intrigue, and larger-than-life characters. And their work is more than a true crime. It's a fascinating reminder that history is often far more complicated and far more interesting than we remember. So welcome, David and Rose. I am so eager to start this conversation. And by the way, anyone on the call who has a question, please don't hesitate to raise your hand, and we'll include you in the conversation. But Rose, I want to start with you, if I may, because I'm so impressed that you had the courage, I guess the courage to follow the threads of this, to unravel the sweater, because you didn't know much about your family of origin, and you unearthed story after story. David had come into the dining room and say something like, "You won't believe what I learned today." And you're discovering parts of your past that, well, let's just say most of us who do family history kind of are looking for the kings and the queens and the presidents and the folks that we can point to and be proud of. But on the other end of the spectrum, there are certainly horse thieves and murderers and prostitute rings and all these things that those stories don't necessarily see the time of day. So I'm eager to start with you, if I may, Rose, and ask you, how do you feel now that this project is completed? Has it changed how you feel about yourself, about your family, about history in general?
Well, I kept telling him to stay out of my family tree, and he wouldn't do it. He was persistent, and I guess my family tree is obviously more interesting than his. And so, I think I didn't pay that much attention a lot of the time when he would come to me with his latest findings, and then it started to get interesting, because we had just the hint of the story about Erastus Wallace Scott, my great-grandfather, only that he had died a scandalous death. That was really all the family knew. And also a little hint about his first wife, my great-grandmother, also having come to a sad end. And so the more he dug and the more he found out, the more interesting it got. And it really became less about my family history and more about the history of Des Moines and a sordid, seedy past that I don't think any of us who grew up in Des Moines were ever aware was part of our past. And the journalist in me got interested in telling a good story. And and it's far enough away. It's in time. It's my early 1900s, my great grandparents. Um, and so I had some detachment, I think, from it. It did sort of explain some of the dysfunctional family I grew up in. But mostly to me, this was just a crazy story that begged to be told.
No kidding, no kidding. And there's still untold mysteries around it, am I right?
That's right. That's right. The murder that we begin the book with is still really unsolved today. We're quite certain that Erastus Scott was part of it, and his cousins in the Carter gang, the notorious Carter gang, that they were involved too. But aside from that, it was the murder of a farmer, and it had to do with a land fraud case. And he was,
They wanted his farm and they didn't want to pay for it.
yeah, and they were trying to defraud him out of his farm, but there was no way to do this without killing him, apparently. And so that really starts the book and is kind of a through line. Um, and you
Well, by through line, that's the way the book starts, and then the murder is still under investigation, and there's still some strands out there, but not much talk of it for a few years until Erastus dies. And after his death, a couple of inmates who were around in 1905 when the murder was planned and committed came out and said, "Well, now that he's dead and he can't kill me, I'm going to tell you that he did it because he told me he did it." And of course, he's dead, so there's no trial. And then it kind of goes back quiet for a while until at the very end of the book, the last member of the Carter gang is finally tracked down and indicted, and he's indicted for the murder as well.
but no one is ever brought to justice for this. No one,
Right.
no one is ever actually found guilty for the murder that begins the book and makes its way through the book.
So, reading between the lines of the book, it sure seems like the case is made that it's your relative who killed the guy, right? I mean, that's certainly the conclusion I came with. Is that not?
Yeah, I think that's probably the fairest conclusion. If he wasn't the trigger man, he certainly knew who was,
And he was part of the conspiracy.
and it was part of the gang. It was a member of the gang that committed this murder, and the gang benefited from it or intended to benefit from it.
Well, there's so many aspects to this story that I want to touch on in our time together. And Doug, I want to pull you into because the time and effort that both Dave, you prefer Dave and Rose took on to track this down, really relied heavily on newspaper archives and those kinds of things are I don't know what's going to happen to those stories of record. But tell us how long it took for you to do the research, how you organized it. Did you travel to Iowa frequently? Did you do this mostly online? Tell us the process.
In terms of the newspaper research, it was all done online. There's two databases that I use, newspapers.com and newspaperarchives.com, which have mostly overlapping, but not entirely overlapping databases, at least with respect to Des Moines and Central Iowa newspapers. And from there, it was just word searches. Initially, I was just looking for articles about Scott's death because we knew that he died in this scandalous situation, and I just wanted to find out what that was about. And that, took me back in time it directed me to this murder in 1905. So I said, well, let me find out what I can find out about that murder. And that murder, we learned, was so widely known, and the public interest was just overwhelming in the murder of this farmer and the theft of his land, that it was carried, for weeks as the grand jury investigation and police investigation, and then for weeks and weeks during what was at the time the longest murder trial in Polk County history. But each time I would find a set of articles like that, it would lead me to something else. I wouldn't have known about the Carter brothers being related to Erastus. I mean, I may have figured it out eventually, but one of their earliest articles made reference to the fact that Will Carter, the guy indicted for the murder of Edward Gresser, was a cousin of Erastus Wallace Scott, who recently killed a man on East Court Avenue
In his
notorious saloon. And I thought, he's got a saloon? This is news. And so then, I used Ancestry.com and census records and other records to determine the connection between Scott and the Carters, and basically they're first cousins once removed. That wasn't hard to do. So then it was just word searches, and you can imagine, using these databases, you can't do a string search to describe for me a murder involving Walter Scott, blah, blah, blah. You are looking for words, articles that contain words. And I spent untold weeks just looking at every article between 1898 and 1920 in which the word Scott appears. And that's Scott as a first name, Scott as a last name, Scott as a typo, Scott as a mistake in the scanning, Scott Street, Scott Avenue, Scott in Ottumwa, Scott in Des Moines, and it's just probably 95% were false positives. But once you found what you were looking for, you could just follow that chronologically and read every article associated with that in chronological order. Did the same thing with the Carters. Unfortunately, Carter also not a terribly uncommon surname. But I looked at every article that I could find for a period of about 20 years in which Carter appeared. And sadly, Carter wasn't just William Carter. He was Will Carter. He was W. Carter. He was W.L. Carter. So you had to do all those permutations. And the same thing really with every other character in the book. We learned about Eli Hardin, the police detective, who we believe we've pretty conclusively shown was in Scott's back pocket and kept Scott out of investigations, and almost certainly kept him from being indicted for Gresser's murder in 1905. I just kept on searching Hardin, spelled a couple different possible ways, until I fell upon the investigation into his sexual harassment of women who were coming into the police station seeking assistance with ongoing police investigations. And
he has the patience.
And on and on and on and on.
To do this.
And
I do not.
In fact, at the end, when we thought we were done several times, I found a whole nother avenue of interesting people connected directly to these events who just his names hadn't come up in any of the other articles. And the reporters at the time, they didn't have databases either. And so unless they mentioned in an article this other connection, you wouldn't find it unless you just doggedly search for the names of these people. And that's how I came upon so many avenues that otherwise were just unknown.
The Registry of Historic Places is typically the mansions in a town, the statues in a town, all of this sort of thing. But there's so many pockets of, well, let's just take the greater Des Moines area that we don't know anything about its history. If you would place where the saloon was located. I assume you've been to the area relatively recently, so you know what's there now. There is a Scott Avenue Bridge that goes.
That's not the one. It's the Court Avenue Bridge that is important to this tale. The Court Avenue Bridge goes east-west from Court Avenue in the west part of town to the Court Avenue Bridge to East Court Avenue. And his saloon was at the corner of East Court Avenue and First Street. So as you're coming over the Court Avenue Bridge, it was the very first thing on the left. Today, if you go there, the very first thing you see is on the right, which is the Municipal Court Building, which was built around 1920 and is on the National Register of Historic Places. And in fact, in the application to put the Municipal Court Building on the National Register of Historic Places, they talk about that building was put there as part of the process of eliminating vice on East Court Avenue. They tore down everything and put that court building up because the bars, the prostitution, the criminal behavior, they finally just put an end to it. And what you see today, if you go there, aside from the municipal court building on your right, on your left is I think it's a 1980s, maybe 1970s era office building built to house originally, I believe, a federal bankruptcy court offices, and now I think it's just a general purpose office building.
So
Everything's gone.
in your research, the Scott Avenue Bridge, which is kind of parallel to the Court
Right, that's
Avenue
right.
Bridge, is not
Yeah.
is not related to no.
No.
We tried to find that out,
Yeah.
and we don't think so. No, although Erastus Scott, his family were prominent among the founders of Des Moines, and so and in fact, his a relative of his had owned a lot of the land in East Des Moines, and including a big parcel that they donated to the state for the construction of the Capitol building. And what stands out to me is that this neighborhood, which was really was a slum, basically,
Yeah.
just a few blocks down the street from the gleaming gold domed Capitol building, and that and this small neighborhood was such a hotbed of vice, like Dave said, nasty saloons, Erastus's saloon being the nastiest of them, and a brothel above. And that was what the neighborhood was like. It was full of prostitution and crime, and was just not a place that you wanted to venture into. Right across the bridge from what is now downtown Des Moines, and the merchants and businesses on the west side of the river complained about this slum just over the bridge, and the effect that had on their business. And so it was a thorn in the side of the city leaders for quite some time, until they eventually just tore it all down to get rid of the problem.
And yet you mentioned in the book that the city founders were dependent on the income from the prostitutes and those who were in that business to keep the city afloat. Is that
Yeah,
accurate?
that's what the papers reported. And initially, they were getting a lot of revenue from the fines on bars being operated illegally, and they cracked down on that. But they so that and that revenue was replaced by the fines imposed on the houses of prostitution, to the point where they literally couldn't afford to lose that revenue base from the fines on the prostitution business. They needed that money. And so although there was discussion in 1903, 1904, and even some effort in 1905 to start shutting down the houses of ill repute, as they called them, that didn't last very long because the city needed the money. It wasn't for another 3 years when the syphilis problem got to be so bad that they literally rose up and just demanded it be stopped.
Yeah. So, Dave, what was going on in your lives at the time these stories started catching your attention? Were you in the midst of COVID quarantine? Did that play a
Yeah,
role?
Yeah.
Okay.
yeah. I had some time, and then these databases kind of came to my attention, and I'd had one of them for a while. And one day I thought, I've never actually seen a good copy of that article about Scott's death in 1912. Let me see if I can find that. And that very quickly led me to the murder investigation of Carter in 1905 and Scott's involvement in that, and then the previous murder Scott had engaged in 1903. And then I just took that back in time to find the history. Where did Scott and his family live? Where did they move? Why? And other really violent acts the man had engaged in since about 1899.
He was a very bad man.
And so it still, there was no thought of writing a book at all until I think the Carter gang really came to life from the research, and we learned so much about their land ownership and the interesting, tale of that family, where half the family split up, the husband and the older children moved to California, leaving the wife behind, and one son in prison, two others that near as we can tell, were all involved in criminal activity of some sort. We know they were involved in theft, probably land fraud, that led us to, a big, even after the Carter trial was over for Gresser's murder, another major land fraud of an individual doctor in Des Moines who they basically tried to get his house and exchange it for a piece of dead land by a railroad track in Kirksville, Missouri. Um, and that whole story and the coverage of that, and it just kept on getting so much broader than the original inquiry that we thought, there's plenty here to do a whole book.
Yeah, it got crazier and crazier, and we just thought we have to tell this story because nobody had.
No, and what a gift it is for not and what a gift it is for historians because these stories do not stay unless somebody tells them. Um, what's been the reaction from friends and from family, and what kinds of what does anybody object to you writing this?
No, there's anybody who probably would object is long gone.
Yeah.
And so and friends, I mean, we've been, as these stories came to light, we've been telling all of our friends and family, you just can't believe this. You won't believe this story. So I think everybody's been kind of fascinated about it. Maybe some of our friends are getting a little tired of hearing about it. Um, but but really, and I think that the sort of hook for this is that this was Des Moines, Iowa, which and I mean, I grew up in Des Moines and I didn't know any of this. And, Des Moines, Iowa is synonymous with, family values, Iowa nice, corn-fed beef,
And it's not that long ago.
Right.
Everybody seems to have forgotten that this was what was
Right.
going on.
I vaguely remember, I don't know who would have told me about it, but I vaguely remember the term red light district. And I remember somebody pointing, I don't know if they were making it up or what does that term mean to you? And where was that in Des Moines?
I think it's pretty generally referred to in different towns as the area where the prostitution business, prostitution business.
Yeah, they also called it the Tenderloin district.
Yeah.
And I think, big towns have what back then was called the Tenderloin district. I had to Google the term, and it came about, I think, because of the idea that the police were bribed to look the other way, for at all crimes that were being committed in these areas. And so they earned enough money that they could afford tenderloin for dinner. I think that's what the term came from. I'd heard the term, but I never knew what it meant. But the interesting thing is that the city was trying to regulate prostitution for the most part, and so they wanted to corral it into a specific area. And
on that point, it wasn't just the money. There were city fathers at the time, and they're quoted in the newspaper saying, look, prostitution's a fact of life. We can't ever get rid of it. So what we need to do is segregate it, put it in an area where it won't be bothering the good people of Des Moines.
Yeah, that's right.
And that the folks who want to do that can do that, and we'll collect the fines and we'll collect the fees, and we'll all just sort of coexist.
And in fact, we talk about the prominent people in Des Moines that were renting their places, their apartments or whatever out to the prostitutes. We talk about Hubble's, Yonkers.
Those are the two.
Those are the two big ones, and certainly Mr. Hubble of Terrace Hill knew he knew what these properties are being used for. And in fact, the businesses themselves got indicted at one point for renting out their property for these brothels, illicit uses.
Yeah.
And the Hubble himself and Yonkers themselves, they weren't indicted, but their businesses were. And I think that was embarrassing enough that I think that kind of helped get them out of that business.
What ties all this to our story is that in 1905, when the city first began to start thinking about cracking down on the houses of prostitution, the first person that got a subpoena from the grand jury was Walter Scott. And because his bar, his brothel was, he wasn't a famous rich guy like the Hubbles and
Yeah,
Yonkers.
that's right.
But he was one of the leaders of all this, one of the people responsible for this. And his bar, as late as 1908, after he's not even in the saloon business anymore, when the Register begins to really editorialize about the need to wipe this out, there's a picture in the center of a full-page editorial, and it's a picture of East Court Avenue focusing on Walter Scott's saloon and pointing to that as the place where this is like epitomizes the problem we have, and this is where it's got to be stopped.
Interesting.
And one little side note here, Dave is calling him Walter Scott. His name was Erastus Wallace Scott, and he went by Wallace. He went by his middle name, which disappointed me because I just thought Erastus was a name that fit this guy best. But for some reason, Wallace often in the newspapers became Walter.
Right.
And so he was either Wallace or Walter or E.W. Scott, and sometimes just Scotty. He was so well known that the headline might just say Scotty, and everybody knew who he was.
Scotty indicted, Scotty going to the pen, Scotty back at the bar, Scotty shutting down his bar, Scotty this, Scotty that.
Yeah.
I'm going to go to Barry Pyatt in a minute, but who's our Washington correspondent with the Iowa Writers Collaborative. Probably spent some time in Oxford, Maryland, where you're currently living. But before I do that, you know what? I completely forgot what my question was. Barry, yeah, it's 76, almost. You're up next. I know it'll come to me. Go ahead.
Well, my question is, have you been able to learn how unusual it was for a city the size of Des Moines to have this little pocket of vice within its borders? I know in Washington, D.C., they used to have, just a few blocks from the White House used to be a massive brothel district. And I suspect that, and of course, wherever the army went during the Civil War, the prostitutes and other people went with them. So was Des Moines was this out of character for towns of Des Moines size to have this issue, or it was pretty common?
We didn't really look at that because we were really focused on the Scott Carters, this criminal gang, and the prostitution, like I said, was pretty important to Scott. He was a pretty central figure in it, but that's what we were focusing on. I mean, having said that, there's quite a good book called Devil in the White City.
Yes.
It's about the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, where that it actually when we were doing the research for this book, I kept on thinking of that book because I thought, my God, this is the same thing that happened in Chicago.
Yeah, I think Chicago, Kansas City, which were bigger towns at least than Des Moines, but Des Moines was the biggest thing in Iowa. And so,
the biggest thing between there and Denver.
That's right. And girls were lured from the small towns and farms to come to Des Moines, usually thinking that they were going to get a job in somebody's restaurant or somebody's business, and they would get to Des Moines and find out that that job didn't exist, and they were instead installed in a brothel. And we tell one really interesting story about a couple of sisters from Lamoni who came to Des Moines to work in a restaurant, and the restaurant didn't exist. There was like a lunch wagon.
It's like 2 doors down from Scott's.
Yeah, right near where the saloon was. And they begin to realize what they're really there for, and they flee the premises basically, and they go to the train station at Valley Junction and go home and tell the story. And then that couple, husband and wife, are indicted and tried, and both go to prison for
years.
Basically, and basically sex trafficking is what they were doing.
But in response to your question, I mean, I can say this. there was nothing that I saw in the Des Moines newspapers that suggested Des Moines was any different than St. Louis, Chicago, Kansas City. I don't know about Omaha. I don't know how big that Omaha was by then, probably about the same size.
But and Des Moines was growing so quickly right then. And I mean, I guess it kind of makes sense that it was, we say in the book that it certainly had all of the ills, the problems, the social ills of bigger, bigger cities across the country.
Yeah.
All right, Douglas, you're up next.
Great to see you both on the call. Thanks for
Hey,
spending so much time on this. And I'll just as a matter of point, we'll be at Beaverdale. We'll have a Beaverdale Books event on Friday, right?
Yep.
July
great.
17th.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anybody that wants to hear more or meet the Donovans in person, we'll just follow my blog or Julie's or follow our Substacks. But Dave, Rose, what about the industrial scale of syphilis? Like the public health aspect of this and the scale you sort of alluded to it before, but this just wasn't a few wayward men showing up to engage with this. This was fairly, I don't know if the right word is common, but it was, prevalent. And the outcome could also, be tracked and just the term, there wasn't penicillin then to deal with syphilis and gonorrhea and other things. But how big of a public health issue was this? And am I right to use the term industrial scale in terms of its effect on public health?
It was huge. If you can believe, if you can believe the newspapers,
If you believe
it
the
was
Des Moines
huge.
Register, they had, like I said, this full page editorial in 1908, and the all caps headline, "The Scarlet Monster's Blight." And according to that article, they say more than three-quarters of the men in Des Moines were afflicted with syphilis by the time they were 30. Venereal disease among women, both, quote, those who invite it and innocent wives who suffer from it through the sole sinfulness of their husbands, accounted for infections of up to a third of all women treated by doctors in Des Moines, and 80% of the deaths of women in the city due to inflammatory disease. So, we are pretty confident that Rose's grandmother died of it, contracted it from her husband. Her Scott was his second wife, was a woman less than half his age who was living in the brothel upstairs from his saloon. We don't know if she had it, but I mean, they probably all had it.
Yeah.
And the only way to get rid of it at that point was to put an end to the prostitution. And I think from what we've seen by 1908, it was, whether the numbers were as bad as the Register was saying in this editorial or not, they were bad enough that the city just simply had no choice but to stop it.
And 1908 was the year that my great grandmother, Scott's first wife, died in Clarinda, the state mental hospital. There was family lore that she died of a social disease, and our research pretty much confirms that she died of late stage syphilis in 1908 in Clarinda.
So some of these prominent families that were involved, that were either like directly involved or adjacent to it, I mean, historically, they're complicit in dozens, if not hundreds, of deaths. Correct?
I don't know how you can argue otherwise.
Yeah.
And I would, they were adjacent to it only in the sense that the companies renting the building were companies owned by them. They weren't owned by them personally, the buildings, because I believe it was Hubble that was confronted by a citizen to complain about all the houses of prostitution in his neighborhood. In this person's neighborhood, they were owned by Hubble. And he basically said, I don't have time to deal with you. And then the papers found a guy who was his property manager, or one of his property managers, and he said he had a separate list of all the brothels that Hubble's business was renting out for prostitution. And it was a lengthy list. And he's quoted as basically saying, he told me he doesn't care. He just wants to make as much money as he can. Because these shacks were worthless, but yet they were able to get, really nice rents out of them because there was so much money being made by the brothels.
You think about present day sex trafficking, and that too is a story that is pretty much one of the most underreported of our time, I think. Do you think about how those are connected to present day nefarious activities, or was that something that crossed your mind?
You know, we touch on a few issues that seem pretty modern today. We discussed the murder of Edward Gresser as being the first drive-by shooting
Yeah,
in Des Moines,
from a buggy.
a buggy shooting. We have a Me Too issue when Eli Hardin is the chief of detectives, when he is accused of sexual harassment and sexual misconduct with a lot of women. And some things never change. We have sex trafficking happening today, and the women, lured into these brothels were an awful lot of unsuspecting young girls with maybe no other options.
And once they got to Des Moines, they didn't have any money.
Yeah.
And what are they going to do? They had nowhere to go. They were promised a job. They were lured in there, and now they're stuck.
Exactly. So we have Ms. Busby on the line. You are up next. If you would just turn your microphone on, and there you go, please.
Thank you. Hi, you guys.
Hi.
How are you? It's good to see
Very
you.
well.
Congrats on your book.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're college for everybody else. We're college classmates.
Yes, yes.
That's great. I did not know
Yeah.
that.
We go back to journalism school at Iowa State. So
Yep. Yep.
congrats on the book. I look forward to getting my side tomorrow night in Iowa City.
Yay!
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you, knowing the gifted writers that you both are, just wondering how your collaboration worked in putting the writing piece together on the book.
Great
It
question.
wasn't always without its bumps.
There were some creative differences.
A few.
So, we started off as journalists together, but Dave had a long and very storied career as a litigator. And so his writing, and you will notice, I don't know, how many footnotes are there in this book? Like 300 or
A
something?
lot.
So
A lot.
his writing, tended toward a little more toward legal writing. And so I worked kind of hard um, to make it more creative. And so there was a lot of, he would send me a chapter, I'd edit, I would make suggestions, send it back to him. We went back and forth like that for a long time. I think
This is an 18-month process. This didn't happen overnight.
yeah, the writing of it.
Yeah, the writing of it.
Writing and editing. And I felt like it got better and better with each one. But I don't know. I still see the flaws. I still see the places where I think, oh, we probably could have told that a little better. But at some point, you got to kind of put the baby out in the world and hope that people like it.
Well, especially as you read other kind of similar accounts. I mentioned Devil in the White City, but there's a lot of books like this that are, historical moments, but they're not fiction. They are nonfiction accounts, and you can tell the writers tried really hard to limit himself to diaries. And now our problem was we didn't have anybody who left a diary.
Yeah.
We only had the newspaper articles to really tell these stories, with just one small exception of a cousin who happened to have interviewed 45 years ago, two nieces of Scott's. And she was a genealogist, and in the course of the memo that she put together, about a page and a half of it touches on some of the events that are in the book, and we made as much use of that as we can to really give it color and life, because otherwise, I was adamant we're not going to put quotation marks around anything that I can't prove. At least there's a contemporaneous account that somebody said that person said those words.
I'm thinking, how would one track down old diaries? Would you put a search in eBay that you'd get an alert if there was a diary from 1908 that came on eBay from Des Moines, Iowa?
Yeah, Ancestry.com has some really interesting databases. They include things like wills, and we did have some information from handwritten wills of some of these characters' parents, describing who got what and naming the kids and providing a little color about what they ended up with. For example, when Sarah Carter dies, she was thought to have had a lot of money, but she didn't. At that point, she was basically broke. Well, I have an itemized list of everything in her household and every penny that she still had. But the other thing that we did was I tracked down descendants of all the major characters in the book and some of the minor characters. And, whether it was descendants of the siblings of the Carters, the descendants of the siblings of Mary Flynn, all the descendants of the Scott family. Scott had how many, 8 siblings?
Yeah.
And all their descendants, many of whom lived in Des Moines. And I just thought, if I'll find somebody out there who's got pictures, an account, maybe a diary, nothing. They didn't know anything about any of this. It was news to every single one of them.
We did get a handful of
Some
pictures,
photographs.
old photos, but this was, like you said, this was news to everybody. This was not something anybody talked about.
So Rose, you mentioned earlier that your family was quote unquote dysfunctional. This is the on your father's side of the family, correct? The
Right.
lineage
Yep.
too.
Mhm.
Say more about that, if you would.
Sure. Well, I mean, my dad was an alcoholic, and um, and we were poor, but he wasn't a criminal, and he wasn't violent like Erastus, like his grandfather was, and he didn't know any of this. My
Wow.
grandmother didn't didn't talk about it, didn't tell anybody. And my dad was one of 6 kids raised right there in East Des Moines, where this all happened.
Yep.
And none of them knew anything, at least not to my knowledge. He had one sister. There were 5 brothers and 1 sister. And I figured if anybody would know, it would have been his sister. And she's been gone for a few years now. But I was talking to one of my cousins, and she said, Aunt Margaret always said the Scots were scoundrels and horse thieves, and the less said about them, the better. And that's all I got. And so I guess it was just not something that family talked about.
Hmm. There's a singer by the name of Marilyn May. Does that name ring a bell? Do you remember that name?
No.
No.
Grew up in the East Side. She's in her 90s now, still performing.
Hmm.
And I just, her name flashed into my mind because her mother raised her as a single parent. And anyway, if I see her in August, I will ask her if she has any recollection of this side of your family, and we'll let you know. But there's got to be ways to find people that knew people.
It's so frustrating because,
If we'd done this in the 80s,
that's right. That's
Yeah.
we
right.
would have found
Yeah,
them.
we would have. And the 80s was when we got the first hint of the story, that he'd had a scandalous death. And my sister went to the State Historical Society and went through microfiche. She knew the date of his death, so she found the story about his death. And we don't really want to go into that because it's part of the book, and you find out what happened to Erastus Scott. It was sad.
But that was the limitations of research back then.
Right.
The only thing she could have done to find what I found would have been to go back to 1903 and turn the pages and read every single article on every page of 3 newspapers for
Right.
20 years. That's impossible. No one could do
Right.
that unless you knew what you were looking for, and nobody did.
But and it was really frustrating to me because the story I kind of wanted to write was more about generational trauma and how this affected my grandmother and her children. But I didn't have the source material for that. They were all gone. Nobody left to ask, and that really, really frustrated me. And then, like we said, the story seemed to get bigger than just a family scandal. It really turned into
Although
a history.
we did really just through the normal genealogy data, we were able to track the family, the mom, Mary, and the three girls. The one married early, moved out to Joliet, Illinois, had some kids, died at I think age 27 or
Yeah, it
something.
was sad.
And then the other two daughters basically took care of their mother. One of them went with her and one of his brothers to take her to Clorinda in 1908, basically to die. And then those two daughters, one of whom was pregnant at the time of her mother's death, right?
Yeah, yeah. My grandmother got married within a few weeks of her mother's death.
As did her
And
sister.
yeah, yeah. And the younger sister, my grandmother was the middle of three daughters. And she and her younger sister both got married within a month or so of their mother's death at Clorinda. And it wasn't until we were working on this book that I started really looking at dates and realizing that my very Catholic grandmother was pregnant when she got married in 1908.
Right.
So Bob
So,
Leonard is, oh, excuse me, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, it would have been great, wouldn't it, to have interviewed those sisters?
Yeah.
Because they lived blocks from all this stuff. Their dad's name was in the newspaper hundreds of times when they were young teenagers, and they had to have known that was him. But you don't know what they thought or how they reacted or who else knew. Did people know they were his daughter? We don't know.
So Bob Leonard is up next. He is also a member of the Iowa Writers Collaborative and does a fabulous job covering all kinds of stories. Bob, I think you're up next. Where are you? I don't see you now.
I'm here.
Okay.
Hi.
Well, first, it sounds like a fascinating book. I look forward to reading it. Brought back some memories for me that my grandfather used to go through that district when he was a young man and would come back. My uncles told me stories that were pretty incredible about. Grandpa didn't talk about it much, but they would tell stories of the women he would meet, and that a lot of women were in upstairs windows and would, when guys were walking by, they'd wave and say, "Come on up." And I remember one of my uncles telling me about how they'd say, "Come on up, Ralph." And I don't know why my grandfather would have told his boys that, but lots of stories about my grandpa in that part of town.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Ah, interesting. Interesting.
My other grandpa was in Fort Madison, by the way. So
Well, so was Erastus. So were his cousins.
All the Carters were spent time there.
yeah.
Well, so Bob, do you wonder about the generational impact of these traumas or these acts or whatever?
Well,
Being
I don't know.
incarcerated is a pretty big deal. Yeah.
Well, we didn't find, yeah, well, I mean, he was a wife beater too. I mean, he was in Fort Madison when he was 17 and used to, beat my grandma all the time. So, there was a divorce, and part of me not wanting anything ever to do with church is my grandmother wanted me to come with her to church, and she was divorced from her wife beating husband, and the preacher was going on and on about the evils of divorce. And I'm sitting next to my grandma. She's holding my hands while she's crying because the preacher is saying she's a terrible, terrible person. And so, if that's generational trauma, I don't. It was certainly traumatic for my grandmother, but it's, I don't know. But I mean, it's in everybody's family, and I think that's one of the things that your book is pointing out, that even people, even the respected businessmen were.
Yep.
I wasn't having a lot of respect for them building their wealth off of the bodies of women.
Right.
Exactly.
So,
Right.
but anyway, so thank you for the book.
And I was surprised at the prevalence of divorce in the very early 1900s. And my great grandmother referred to herself as a widow when her ex-husband was right there a few blocks away, committing crimes. She's listed in the city directory as a widow. and she called herself a widow.
In fact, I think one way to measure the divorce rate in Des Moines might be to take a city directory and look for every woman identified as a widow. I think most of them were divorced.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But that's a powerful statement to declare yourself a widow. What a powerful statement to make. Yeah, my admiration for them.
Well, one of the things that I figured out, so my great grandmother, her parents were Irish immigrants, and they were Catholic, and and then my great grandmother married Erastus Scott, and he was not Catholic, and so I think that had to have been a big problem in that family.
In fact,
And
I found his will, the dad's will, and the dad very carefully enumerates and allocates what little assets he had to each of his sons, and specifically says Mary Scott is to receive nothing. And at
Wow.
that point, she was living, she would have been alone raising her daughters.
Mhm.
It was before she'd gone to Clarinda and, destitute, and she got nothing.
Yeah,
What happened to all that money?
I don't think there was a lot of it, frankly.
Well, I
Okay.
think
The money from the prostitution, you mean?
Well, no,
That-
the farm, the
Oh,
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Sarah Carter, the mother of the Carter brothers, she became this real estate mogul, and we don't know where the money came from, but given all the other facts and circumstances, you got to believe it was the proceeds of theft and fraud. But they owned a lot of property. And she, when her son WL went on trial for the murder of Edward Gresser, she is quoted in the newspaper saying she has $250,000 to spend on his defense. I can't remember the exact number, but I believe $250,000 today is about $7 or $8 million. Now, where this divorced farm wife, who listed herself in the census as either under occupation, either nothing or farm wife, got that kind of money from kids, one of whom had just got out of the pen. The others were just in the real estate, the quote unquote real estate and bail bonds business, got that kind of cash, cannot have come from anything good. But by the time it was all over, I think she had spent enough money. They were probably overextended in real estate. They got to a point where no one would do business with them anymore because of the fraud, the second big fraud that they were all involved in and accused of. And I won't tell you how that came out, but you can imagine after the newspaper coverage, it wasn't good for the family. And then she was in debt. Yeah, I'm trying to think of the word. She was listed as tax default on property after property after property, and section after section after section. There's just lists in these big page listings in the Des Moines Register of the tax liens that were on her properties, until finally the money was all gone. She
Yeah.
spent it all on legal defense fees and God knows what else. But by the time she died in I want to say 14, there was nothing left.
Can you track
And her
down
sons were
the
in prison.
lawyers? Oh, excuse me.
Sorry?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go
her
ahead,
sons
Ron.
were in prison. Her sons were in prison
Yeah.
by then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any idea who the lawyers were by name?
Yes, certainly the ones who defended them at their trials.
Oh yeah.
That one is a former judge, and this
Spurrier.
yeah, Spurrier, and that was another rabbit hole that I went down because I wanted to find out who this guy was, because they referred to him as Judge Spurrier even as a no longer a judge, and he seemed, this guy had some self-confidence, let me put it that way. And he said things to judges and to opposing counsel in courtrooms that would get you disbarred today. And that was his shtick. I imagine a book could be written just about that guy, because the two trials that he was involved in that we recount in the book, he clearly had a bigger caseload than that.
Wow. Okay, so Dave, how do you top this with your side of the family?
My family is much more recent in the United States. On my mom's side, they were involved in bringing German immigrants beginning around 1830. They founded Carroll County.
But we're pretty sure they were bootlegging during Prohibition.
Well, everybody bootlegged. They were Catholic.
Okay.
Everybody was bootlegging in Prohibition.
Templeton Rye, perchance? Templeton Rye?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, in fact, there's a book called Gentlemen Bootleggers that's about Templeton Rye during Prohibition, and I think about half the characters in that book are cousins of mine, including the police chief, who's my great uncle.
About that.
They wrote the book.
Oh,
It's
they
already
did.
been
Okay.
written. So those are my German ancestors, and on the Irish side, they came over dirt poor in 1860, and then my great grandfather in 1874. We came over alone when he was 13, and managed to work his railroad across to Joliet, where his parents were, who he had left him behind when he was 8 months old. He didn't know them, they didn't know him, and his older brothers made fun of him because he dressed and sounded like an Irishman.
All right,
If you can
let's
imagine
write that
the
book.
irony of that. That's the whole story. There's nothing, no criminals in there anymore.
Oh, that you know of. I love it. I love it. I'm so excited you're coming to the retreat. You know, Doug is so persuasive, I think. But what are you looking forward to coming? I've got to put you on at least a panel or do a
Oh, we'd love,
workshop. You got, I mean,
yeah.
are you okay with that?
Oh,
We'd love
absolutely.
that.
Yeah,
We'd
yeah.
love that. And even I'd be happy to talk about the research methods that we used and the how I organized the data, which I went into it not knowing I was going to find 700 newspaper articles. I thought I was going to have six. So it kind of mushroomed and became a real interesting project of how to put it all together and keep track of it.
Well, since you're paying participants, I want you to have fun too, but I would love it if you would be heading a workshop. That would be so great. What are you looking forward to with the retreat?
I was interested in a couple of people talking about how to do a screenplay,
Yes,
because it does seem to me that I don't know that either of us have the skill to do it, but it does seem to me that this book in the hands of the right person could be, several people commented to us, who's that guy? Who's that guy that writes the Western like Yellowstone and
Taylor Sheridan.
Taylor? Several
Yeah.
people said, "Oh my God, if Taylor Sheridan turned this into a series, this would be perfect for that." Because I really think it tells a story of America that certainly the people in the Midwest don't know, and certainly the people on the coast don't know. So
right.
I'd be interested in. I don't know anything about screenplay writing, and I'd be interested in knowing more
So
about it.
I've been to many creative writing workshops, as in creative nonfiction, and I'm always trying to learn how to really overcome my journalism training, and write more creatively. It's not easy to get over that. Frankly, I'm a recovering journalist. I say. So yeah, I love being around other writers. And one of the things that I've discovered is that, I mean, I swear to God, every boomer is writing a book, and they're all working out childhood trauma, I think. So I just like being around other writers and really trying to hone the craft. And Dave has not had that experience. And so, I was trying to be his creative workshop for the book, with putting in there everything that I've learned over the years.
I love your book and it's very fact-based. And I love to see you get into some of these memoir writing things where you really
Mhm.
kind of get in touch with, you cry, you do, all of these things, whatever you do anything about it. But it's fascinating. And I'll happily introduce you to a number of people who are going to be doing workshops that I think you would love. And definitely, I'm so thrilled. David Kirkpatrick, who's the former president of Paramount,
Right,
is going to be with us, and
Yeah.
right.
he is devoting this time of his life, this retirement phase of his life, to helping people get their screenplays to the screen. So, well, you've come to the right place. I can't wait to meet you in real time, and uh, thank you
Actually,
for,
one thing, if I could just,
yeah.
we thought of this too late to put it in the book in the preface or the introduction, but it's about AI, and
Yes.
we we very consciously didn't use any AI for anything. None of the research, none of the writing, none of the structure, literally nothing. The only thing I used AI for was over the 2 years or so after we decided we were going to write a book. Every once in a while, I would go online and I would ask the AI, "What do you know about Erastus Wallace Scott? What do you want to know about the Carter Gang? What do you know about Eli Hardin?" And every time it came back and said, "Nothing. I've got no information about any of these things." So we thought, okay, well, we're on to something here. No one else has written about this. And then the book came out in pre-release in April or thereabouts. And I asked AI again, AI said, "Oh, I can tell you all about these people. Let me tell you about Erastus Wallace Scott. Let me tell you about his saloon. Let me tell you about the Carter Gang." And I thought, "Oh, somebody beat us to it." And you get to the bottom, and the source, it's us. We are the source for all this. And about a third of the facts this thing relayed were wrong.
Oh,
Uh,
no.
so, I look at it and go, and I even asked it, I said, "You said this guy got convicted for this crime. He never even got indicted." And it comes back and says, "Oh, you're absolutely right. I'm terribly sorry. But I assume that since he got arrested and accused, that he must have got indicted. And if he got indicted, he must have got tried. And if he got tried, he must have got convicted." And I said, "Well, that's useful. That's really useful to know." So, so just avoid AI. It's just it leads you down. And I've got like 6 more stories like that, not about our book, but about related research.
Well, I would definitely include that in a workshop for
Yeah,
sure. All right. Well,
yeah.
I can't wait to introduce you to a bunch of people and good luck with the book. Do a recap of where you're going to be appearing in the next few days. Prairie
Yes.
Lights tomorrow night, or is
Prairie
that
Lights
Prairie
tonight?
Lights tomorrow at 7.
7, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On Thursday, we're at Beaverdale Books.
Yeah. Thursday we're at Beaverdale Books.
17th.
Friday we're at Plain Talk
Plain Talk
Books
Books.
in the East Village.
Plain Talk is just a couple blocks from where the saloon was.
Well, hold on
Yeah,
a second, because I think you're at
look at the
Beaverdale
calendar.
Books on the
Look at the
17th.
calendar.
Well, anyway, I'll verify all
Yeah,
that. Get
it's the
it.
other way around.
It's the other way around.
We're at Plain Talk Books on the 16th at 5
p.m.
and then we're at Plain Talk Books, or and then we're at Beaverdale Books the next day, the 17th
Okay, great.
at 7.
No, I think 5:30.
Oh, 5:30.
I'll send you the links.
One more question, and that is, if somebody's listening to this and they think one of their relatives might have information you would find interesting, how would they, I assume you would like to hear from them, do they reach you?
Yeah, I'm at davedono@gmail.com. They can also reach us through our Facebook page, The Nastiest Saloon in Iowa, which is, a public page that anybody can get access to. And I think we even put that email address in the introduction of the book.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Dave and Rose Donovan, our guests today, co-authors of The Nastiest Saloon in Iowa, Murder, Prostitution, and Corruption in the Heartland. And come to the Okoboji Writers Retreat and you'll get to meet them in person. Thanks again, you guys.
Thank you.
Very much.
It was great fun. Thanks to all the other participants as well.
You bet. Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.